Hello everyone, and welcome to this week's Motor Trade Radio podcast, powered by eBay Motors Group, with Philip Nothard and Curtis Hutchinson, bringing you all the chatter that matters.
Well, Phil, that was another quiet week for the automotive industry, wasn't it?
Well, I mean, it's get a drink, take a comfortable seat, and sit tight for this week's show because it's been a busy week in the headlines, which we've got a few stories that we're going to cover, but we have utilised a little bit of our interviews to cover some of the headlines as well, haven't we, this week?
We have indeed, because during the week we caught up with ICDP's Steve Young for a special standalone episode, which, I mean, it ended up being a fascinating conversation, didn't it? Because we covered agency and whether or not OEMs really can make that cultural shift from, as Steve said it, from wholesalers to retailers. He had lots to say on that, didn't he?
Yes, yeah, and I mean, we will be, like I say, playing a little bit of a snippet of Steve's interview this morning for you. But as always, it is a small snippet of a very insightful interview there with Steve. So, if you haven't listened to it already, please check your podcast feed and have a listen to that interview with Steve, because it does cover a lot of the context that we've been talking about in general. And even Steve does allude to that right at the start of the interview, doesn't he? That he can't believe how much has gone on since he last came on to update on what's happening in the market and how different it has changed. So yeah, don't miss that one.
Yeah, because we did actually get him to talk about a couple of breaking stories with Genesis going into the physical world, as well as the Renault UK network call that we covered on last week's pod. So there's a lot of buying and selling acquisitions. So there was a lot of ground covered, and it's all very, very topical. So do urge you to give that one a listen.
And a story we're not really going to go into much detail this week on is the JLR and the Tata that have finally gone through with their £4 billion investment in the Gigafactory in Somerset. Obviously, this is about creating 4,000 jobs and thousands more in the supply chain. So we've been talking about this, has been bubbling on in the background, and it's been in news, as you would expect, because this involves the political landscape in terms of this negotiation between the UK government and Tata for support in this investment. But actually, this does set the UK very well in terms of some of our European and international counterparts, in terms of that production of battery technology in the UK, and obviously taking advantage of that site down in Somerset. So the news is that deal has gone through, and that Tata will and have committed to invest $4 billion in a gigafactory in Somerset in the UK.
Yeah, it's a massive story. It really is. I mean, just to give it some context, I don't think anything has happened quite as big as this. I think you'd have to go back to the sort of mid to late 80s when you had Nissan, Honda and Toyota moving into the UK to build plants. So it really is a hugely significant story, this, because not only will JLR be obviously building batteries for their Jaguar and Land Rover brands, but my understanding is that they will also act as a supplier to other car manufacturers. And this really does address some of the imbalances that we've been talking about on the podcast about importing EVs back into Europe. If the batteries are made in the UK, it just makes us a bit more competitive, doesn't it?
It does, and in addition to that, as I touched on, the jobs, the investment in the supply chain, and the investment into the economy and what that does for the UK economy in terms of import, export, and that supply chain. So it's fantastic news for the UK automotive sector, but also for the UK economy as well.
It's also an incredibly tight timeline because it's due to open in 2026. So we're talking 3 years. That's pretty ambitious, but they've obviously got plans in place. So let's see how that one develops. And yeah, we will be sort of coming back to this story, I'm sure, from time to time.
We will. And this week we have got a special interview as well as playing the snippet there with Steve Young. So after the end of the show, we will be chatting to Keyloop's Megan Harvey about some of the day-to-day integration issues facing franchise dealers who representing OEMs moving to agency around that whole DMS environment. So please do stay tuned to the end of today's podcast and have a listen, because it's a fascinating interview there with Megan Harvey from Keyloop.
Motor Trade Radio podcast, powered by eBay Motors Group.
Headlines this week are from Auto Retail Agenda, Car Dealer and Motor Trader. And I guess the big story of the week is Looker's takeover by Canada's Alpha Auto Group in doubt after Constellation withdraws support. Used car market has been resilient during first half of 2023, reports Cox Automotive, buoyed by strong demand and improved year-on-year performance. Dealers are considering exiting gap sales in the run-up to the FCA's new consumer duty rules, says EMAC. And lastly, buyers visiting showrooms and forecourts want freedom to browse unaccompanied. But we're going to start this week's headlines with ICDP's Steve Young's view on what would have prompted online retailer Genesis to partner up with several high-profile UK dealer groups to represent them. Now, Steve, another breaking story from this week saw Genesis, Hyundai's premium digital brand, announce it was dipping its toes into the physical world by signing up 7 dealer groups. And that includes some big names, because there's Arnold Clark, Pendragon, Ancaster, and Hendy. The number of outlets they'll open between them is unknown at the moment, but Genesis is already saying it will add more. And these, of course, will all operate under agency agreements. Now, previously, Genesis only had these shopping centre outlets and sold online. So do you think this shows the limitation of pure direct sales?
Well, it's a path that's already been trodden by Tesla and others. Some of the Chinese, with the models they have in continental Europe, will follow of that, I'm certain. I think the shopping mall outlets are fine for generating awareness amongst people who are not in the active part of their buying journey, so that they see a brand in a shopping mall, the sort of big destination type shopping malls, and then if they are coming into a purchase journey, they might just sort of say, you know what, I'll have a look at Genesis or I'll have a look at Tesla. But they're not great locations to sell from, and few of the shopping mall outlets actually generate anything like an acceptable sales volume to be financially viable. So you have to consider them as being in part a marketing investment, and that's fine at that stage. But if you look at what Tesla's done, then progressively, and this is not just true in the UK, it's true in Europe, it's true in the States, they have closed shopping mall style outlets and opened simple dealer facilities, in some cases taking over facilities from other brands like Ford and Honda. So the Genesis is only going down that path. So I'm, not in the slightest bit surprised that they're going down the path. And also, given the Genesis is, the premium brand of Hyundai and Kia, which the big groups already have grown to love, then I'm not surprised either that they've been able to attract very credible investors as the partners for that business. I think it's a path that we'll see others do, others follow in the future. Just a migration, launch the brand, migrate into more traditional dealerships, but probably do so under agency. Why would you go straight to franchise if you're starting from a clean sheet of paper?
That's an interesting point, Steve. So do you think this was part of the original plan for Genesis, or is this a pivot in response to maybe lack of sales? I don't know.
I'm not privy to the internal discussions that took place, 3-4 years ago. We've known it's been coming for a while, but whether that was always in the master plan or it's a change of direction, I don't, a pivot, as you say, I don't know. It would certainly be in my plan. I would never assume that a primarily direct-to-consumer online channel plus a few shopping mall outlets was going to support any decent volume of sales. And Genesis obviously have got ambitions to build significant volume. They're not talking about selling 1,000 cars.
Motor Trade Radio podcast, powered by eBay Motors Group.
Heading over to the first story of this week, and as Kirsty said, the big story that has hit this week, and it's an evolving story, I think we need to say on this one, Curtis. We're not quite sure what is, where this will end up. And actually, without giving too much away with Steve Young's interview, we do talk about sort of acquisitions in the UK automotive sector and international investment in the UK and other markets. But for now, we're going to head over to Auto Retail Agenda and talk about the update on Looker's takeover in doubt after Constellation withdraws their support. Now, obviously, this is because that Constellation, who you'd be aware that do own the Marshall Motors, Cinch, BCA, and We Buy Any Car, they own 19.2% of the shares in Lookers, and they've held back from the support on the acquisition from the Canadian firm Alpha Auto Group, who obviously made the initial offer of 120 pence a share back in June of this year.
Yeah, and that had the support of 42% of the shareholding. However, as the story points out, that percentage has been dropping over the past month as major shareholders sold some or all of their stock in the retailer. But the announcement on Friday was that Constellation plans to vote against the deal, and Alpha Auto's support had dropped to just 30.5%. So, as you say, this is an evolving story. It is going to move on, and I suspect it's going to move on pretty quickly, because if Constellation is out of the running, I strongly suspect, and I'm not alone in this, that there are other interested parties. And certainly as we recorded this, Lithia was being mentioned in a number of stories. Lithia, of course, bought Jardine Motors most recently as their first dealer group in the UK, and they are looking to expand. We know that. We know they want to grow in the UK, and that they must be interested in Lookers now.
Yeah, and I think there was a view, I think, and generally cosmetic that at 120 it was a good value acquisition in many ways, because everyone were talking about its asset holding and its position of freehold, etc., across the business. And I think it will be now very interesting as to what their response is to the latest on the blockage of this, and then who does step in at what price they step in, because now you've had this benchmark baseline figure in terms of the stock value on the business, and shares have been moving very quickly at 120 a share. They have obviously dipped on the back of this news, but it's going to be an evolving one, as we say there, Curtis, isn't it? And one that I'm sure will be eagerly watched by many, because as you're referring back to Steve's interview there on your podcast feed, there was a lot of international PEs that are looking at the UK and European markets for acquisition, Lithia being the most dominant one in the headlines, but there is people from South Africa, Canada, Japan, and other areas that are looking at further growth of the automotive sector. So this is going to get very interesting indeed.
Yeah, and I do suspect we'll return to this probably next week. So
Yes.
stay tuned for that.
Yeah.
So next headline today is from Car Dealer, and it is used car market has been resilient during first half of 2023. So this is research that you guys at Cox Automotive have done, looking at how the used car market trended over the course of the first 6 months. And this is pulling in data from Mannheim, Dealer Auction, and Next Gear Capital as well, isn't it? So what's the snapshot showing you of how the sector performed and what actually drove it?
Yeah, I think we're trying to get a view of where we are in terms of a year-to-date H1 position as we head into the second half of the year, what that looks like in terms of compared to 2022, but more importantly, where does that market look compared to pre-pandemic? Because we know that the pandemic in the last 3 years has severely disrupted the sector, but trying to look at the way the market has shifted. So if you look at Mannheim, for instance, the vehicles going through Mannheim, year on year, the average age of those vehicles has increased by approximately 3%, but actually the average age of vehicles observed through the auction lanes has increased by 25% since the same period in 2019, which is no surprise really, because cars have been in the leasing contract hire sector for longer. Retailers are keeping more cars for retail now, and rather than send them into the wholesale environment. But that's replicated as well within the next gear data that we've seen as well, that the average age of the vehicles that are funded through next gear has again increased 23% since the first half of 2019, and similar increase of 7% year on year. But again, cap clean performance. We're sort of saying, what does this year look like? And it's it's a bit challenging out there, but average cap performance in Mannheim is 96.4% for the first half of the year, and that's up 3% compared to 2019. So although 2019 was a strong year for used cars, it was only performing at 93.8% of cap for that first half of the year in 2019, whereas this year average performance is 96.4. So, there are challenges out there, but I think, clearly the message is that the first half of this year has been a very resilient marketplace for used cars. We know volumes are down, but performance figures are there and they are performing well.
And you make some interesting observations in the research about how the defleets from the leasing and rental companies who are sitting on aging stock is benefiting the used car sector, because we've got those cars finally coming back in. But you also make an observation about the age of vehicles. They're not necessarily getting any younger yet, are they, in terms of the vehicles coming back into the sector?
No, there's a lot to wash through now. I mean, you've got to remember how many vehicles we've lost from the new vehicle market for the last 3 years, and we're still not going to be at pre-pandemic new car registrations by the end of this year. So the vehicles that are out there, they have been on contract extensions. They are out there with higher mileage, older vehicles, and it'll take a long time for those vehicles to wash through. So even as we see new car registrations now starting to recover, that half year point. Year on year, we're 18% up, but we're still 25% down on the 6 months pre-pandemic for 2019 in terms of new car registration. So we're not quite there yet. So there's going to be a long while before we do wash through. So the type of vehicles, the age, condition and mileage on the vehicles that we will be seeing in that wholesale market will continue to be older than that we would have seen in pre-pandemic days for some time now. And it'll take, like I say, quite a while for that to wash through the sector. But moving on to motortrader.com, and this is a story from EMAC, and this is dealers are considering exiting gap sales. Now, This isn't the first time Gap has been mentioned in headlines, because we went through changes before around Gap sales and the responsibility of Gap sales. But this is changing again, isn't it, Curtis, in some work that EMAC have been doing, and alongside, obviously, since the FCA and obviously the new consumer duty regulations that have come into play on the 31st of July.
Yeah, I did some work with the guys at EMAC on this particular release, and it's fascinating what we're going through at the moment, because consumer duty regulations become mandatory from 31st of July, and what Gap is, what EMAC is saying in this story is that this has prompted a lot of dealers to actually review the products that they sell in terms of Gap, and the processes as well, to ensure that they can meet the sort of clearer and higher consumer standards that are being brought in as a result of the FCA's consumer duty. And EMAC does actually say that this is prompting some dealers to actually close the books on new Gap business, or just move out of it from the 31st of July. So there's some interesting dynamics going on here.
Yeah, and it is interesting, because I think there's a change on this now, that there is we all remember the treating customers fairly, doing the right thing, treating customers fairly. But somebody muted that maybe the clue is in the name. It is now the duty, that you need to look after your customers. It's not about treating them fairly. It is your duty to do the right thing for your customers. So there's a big change coming here, and like you say, that the impact on that Gap sales is going to be changing as well, because it is about doing the right thing, being transparent, and clearly that these will be measured as well, that they've got to prove that they are doing the right thing to the customer now, going forward. So it's going to get very interesting, this one, Curtis.
Yeah, definitely. And a lot of this is is down to margin. And Serkan Obers, the automotive warranty director at EMAC, actually says, under the new regulations, the strong margins traditionally associated with selling Gap may need to be reduced to demonstrate to the FCA they are competitively priced against Gap products being offered online outside the dealer sales channel. So that's pretty key. And he goes on to say, for many dealers, these lower margins will render future Gap sales unattractive.
You're listening to All the Chatter That Matters on Motor Trade Radio, powered by eBay Motors Group. This is your weekly one-stop shop for all the biggest car retailing headlines from across the media, available on demand wherever you are on your podcast feed.
And the final headline this week, before our chat with Keyloop's Megan Harvey, is from Motor Trader, and it is buyers in showrooms want freedom to browse. So this story is based on research done by eBay Motors Group. It's part of their Consumer Insight panel, which polls the views of just over 2,000 customers, and it found that 40% of customers like to be greeted upon arrival at showrooms, but then be left alone to wander around. 20% also want to be unaccompanied, but appreciate a member of staff checking on them from time to time to see if they actually require any assistance, while a further 14% prefer to visit the reception desk to outline what they're looking for and then be left alone to look. So there is a bit of a theme creeping into this film.
Yes.
That customers basically want to be left alone in the dealership and in the showroom and on forecourts.
And I mean, just to add to this, I mean, there's some great insight coming from the consumer insight panel at eBay Motors Group over recent weeks, aren't there? I mean, some of this around the part exchange side of the business and things like this is all starting to emerge now, and I think those listening to the podcast should be finding this really useful in how they operate. But like you say there, it's about timing, isn't it? That they still want interaction. They would still want to speak to an advisor. They still want to interact, but it's when and at what part of that process they want that interaction. And to your point, they just want to be left alone to do what they're doing, either in the digital space or the physical space, until the right moment comes where they want that interaction from the forecourt salesperson or the meet and greet or whatever that is. But it is very, very fascinating how this is now starting to emerge, particularly now that we are back to physical showrooms and we talk about digital disruptors and things like this. But I mean, Lucy Tugby does say that when it comes to buying a car, freedom to look around without a salesperson is a desirable part of the dealership experience for consumers, which is keys there, isn't it, with this one, Curtis?
It is, yeah. And as you and I know on the podcast, Phil, the timing is absolutely critical, because the research also found that the closer that customers are to actually buying, so if they're only a month away from making that purchase, the more interaction they actually want. So when buyers are looking to make that purchase within a month, only 17% want to be left alone. So that's dropping down from that 3/4 that we were talking about at the beginning of the story. So I think the sort of messaging behind this is that the importance of dealer staff to qualify customers and then just leave them alone, because as you mentioned, the quote from Lucy, they've already done a lot of research before they've come into the showroom, before they've stepped on the forecourt. So a lot of them will know pretty much what they're looking for. They'll know the prices, they'll know the models. So it's just qualifying them, finding out where they are in the buying journey, and stepping back, leaving them alone, and saying, if you want more information, you know where to find us. We're at the reception desk or wherever. So it's reading the room, isn't it?
It is, yes, for definite. So we do have to try that our best with our interviews and our podcasts on a regular basis. But yeah, we do.
Motor Trade Radio podcast, powered by eBay Motors Group.
Next on Motor Trade Radio, we're delighted to welcome our special guest, Megan Harvey, Chief Alliances Officer at Keyloop, the international supplier of dealer management systems. Now, she's joining us for a chat about how agency is impacting dealer management systems, and also some of the day-to-day integration challenges facing dealers. So welcome to the show, Harvey.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm pleased to be here with you both.
Thank you. Thank you.
You're more than welcome. And before we go any further, can you just share with the listeners why you prefer to be called by your surname? Because otherwise they're going to think I'm being incredibly formal.
Yeah, I get that a lot. I have 3 names, and I just picked the one that I liked the most, which happens to be my surname. So that's the one that I go with. But it's people always get hung up on it. It's very interesting. And for a long time, I thought that I had to go with my first name, because by decorum, that is, what society tells you need to do. And I just stopped listening to society, so that's why I go by Harvey.
Well, that's a good answer, Harvey, and totally get that. I don't have a middle name, so I've just got the option of Curtis or Hutchinson. How about you, Phil?
Yeah, we won't go through mine. I mean, I certainly won't want to be called Nothard. I mean, that causes me enough issues as it is just as a surname. I certainly want to be called by that as my main name. So we'll keep that one to one side, shall we? I mean, a great explanation there, and why not? Let's why not? I mean, as Kurt said, welcome to the show, and just a good chat, and it'll be great to get some of the insight from within what you're doing within Keyloop and what you're seeing as a business. So to begin with, I mean, obviously with a growing number of the OEMs now adopting the topic of the sector at the minute, the agency model. What are the practical day-to-day DMS integration challenges for dealers, especially those operating a mix of agency and traditional franchise? Because it's obviously, as we go through this period where some OEMs are transitioning towards agencies, some are standing back and not transitioning at all. What's happening in that key element of the DMS system now?
Yeah, I think that the practical day-to-day challenges are what they have always been. They're just a little exacerbated right now. And that at the heart of it, it's really data synchronization, connectivity to multiple systems, and making sure that that flow of data is succinct, but also gives the customer the experience that they're looking for. And I think that customer experience has been largely overlooked for quite some time, and is the thing that we should be doing when we think about how we're architecting our internal technology stack and our systems. Like, what is the thing that gives the customer the best customer experience? And then working back from that. And, a lot of the OEMs, as they shift models, their connectivity with the dealerships, there's a lot of customer experience in there that's just not optimal. Customers receiving 2 invoices, one from the dealership, one from the OEM. You have even just something as simplistic as an email telling you about, new test drives coming up, or servicing opportunities. There's one coming from the OEM, there's another one coming from the dealership. So it's really that flow of data and that connectivity. And I think that's a real challenge. And it has been for some time.
I was just going to say there before sort of Curtis jumps in, it's always been an issue, hasn't it? This DMS system, trying to get those systems integrated with, from a customer perspective, and the dealer and the OEM. And I mean, it's, we're in a very good place compared to where we were many years ago, but it's still not quite seamless yet, is it?
Yeah, I don't think it is. And I think we like to think of buying a car as, one of the most expensive purchases that you'll ever make besides buying a property or a home. And therefore, we think it'll be treated differently or thought of differently in a customer's mind. And while it is, there is a lot of financing and it is a big decision, I expect my car buying or servicing journey to be as easy as anything else that I do, and as streamlined as anything else that I do, from, ordering food on Deliveroo, or buying goods online from a retailer. And so if we're not matching pace with the customer expectations, their experience with us will be suboptimal. And that's where you start to erode customer loyalty, and that stickiness starts to disintegrate, even though they may be loyal to the brand.
Now, Harvey, following on from that, I mean, you do make some really interesting points about this focus on achieving the best customer experience possible, because the customer doesn't know if the dealer is agency or not agency. There's no need for them to know that. They just want, as you say, these seamless transactions. So in your view, how are those OEMs who are actually introducing agency approaching the challenge of integration, and as you mentioned before, avoiding double invoicing and things like that? And also, should they be doing more, as they're the ones who are actually imposing this change on dealers?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. I think that in my experience with all the OEMs that we work with, the ones that are moving are doing a lot of research internally, and trying to get the flow of data and those systems all connected, so that there is one invoice, that double keying doesn't exist. The connectivity between a consumer buying a car online and then that order populating in the dealer system, there's no lag in time between those two things, so everything is in coordination. I think they're doing a really good job in terms of trying to connect all the technology. I think the miss is actually working more closely with dealers, and coming to the table together to come to a solution. Now, I caveat that with the fact that the majority of dealers, from my experience, I mean, there are some standout ones that are kind of the tip of the spear in terms of early adopters, but the majority of dealers are reticent about the agency model. And so getting them to the table is easier said than done to have those types of conversations. But it's almost like the dodge of safety in numbers. Like you really need everyone to come together to figure out both sides, because the OEMs can't figure it out in a vacuum in its entirety, because of course you have the dealers that you need to work with. So everyone needs to come to the table and talk through the entire customer journey and the synchronicity between systems and how that will all work. Interestingly, I travel around the world a lot. I was meeting with some dealers actually in South Africa, and South Africa and Denmark tend to be two markets where OEMs test things out because they're smaller, they're more controllable, and then you also have kind of a critical mass of dealers there that are willing to try new things. And so they typically test things there, and then they'll take them to other markets. And so the OEMs or the NSCs that I was meeting with in South Africa were taking their learnings that they had in market and talking to the companies in the UK, giving them advice on how to implement and where their stumbling blocks were. And I think that that's a really clever thing to do. That cross-pollination and the sharing of experiences not only will help them in that journey, but then of course nets out to a better customer experience at the end of the day, which I think is really the goal here.
You make some interesting points there, Harvey, because really the OEMs and retailers, they're coming from they've got a different cultural look at what they bring to the party. In that retailers very much focus on selling cars, which is something that OEMs don't do themselves. So, in your experience, as you're talking and dealing with dealers and OEMs transitioning to agency, is there a greater awareness and understanding amongst the OEMs of where the dealer is coming from in terms of retailing and the need to have systems in place to help them do what they've always done before anyway?
There definitely is a good level of recognition. And I think it's like a puppy with feet that are too big. Everyone is trying to iterate and trying to modernize the way that they go to market to meet the changing customer demands and expectations. So I think that the OEMs, from my experience, are doing the best they can in terms of moving things forward and adopting new methods to get to the market. But you're right in saying that, historically OEMs didn't sell cars. And I think that there is, I know that's kind of sounds like a stupid sentence to say, but there's a lot behind that. Dealers know how to push cars into market. They know how to move the stock. They know how to pull in used stock and all of those levers. They're experts at this. So there has to be some good collaboration between the two parties to make this successful. And we're seeing varying degrees of success. I won't quote any of the brands, but you can just look over the sales numbers in the UK in recent months of brands that are moving to agency and are not, and the impact that that's having on their sales markets or their sales data as they start to adopt this new methodology. I just think there are a lot of learnings, and it's one of those things that it'll take some time to really fine tune and land it well. But again, at Keyloop, we are architecting our software we always talk about customer first, and really the customer is the one that will. I mean, I know the dealers are feeling the pain as well, but the customers are the ones really at the end of the day that will feel the pain and the friction between dealers and OEMs. So as whatever we can do to mitigate that, and really give that connectivity, the technology behind the scenes so that it is as seamless as possible, is really something that we all should jointly explore and work on together.
Yeah, I mean, some very, very interesting points there. And as you say, I mean, it needs to win, for all three parties, the retailer, the OEM, and predominantly the consumer, the buyer, the customer in all of this. So whatever comes out at the end of these transitions, and we already know that, the difference between a franchise agreement and agency agreement, there is this hybrid sort of dealer agreement coming out of the middle of it all as the OEMs realize how operational the retailer is in the whole process of retailing. But just to move away a little bit from the topic of agency, and you touched on it before, against that markets that you talk to and you go and visit and are involved with globally. And you mentioned obviously South Africa and Denmark in that conversation, but historically, UK dealers would travel to NADA to go and learn what's happening over in the US to what potentially is going to be happening over in the UK. And we know that there's lots of M&A activity now happening in the UK and Europe from not just US businesses, but South African businesses, Scandinavian businesses, etc., etc. But in terms of DMS and what would you say are some of the best practices? I mean, you kind of mentioned there about South Africa and Denmark testing quite vigorously before they go to market. For UK listeners this morning, listening to this interview, what would you advise are some of the best practices that you've sort of noticed in other markets?
Well, I think, one of the biggest ones that we see is that any change management that you do, whether it be the agency model or anything else, any optimization that you're trying to achieve within a dealership, the technology is actually 30% of it. And we talk about the technology a lot, work for a technology company, so I could speak about it ad nauseum, but really 70% of it is human behavior. And so some of the dealerships that I know that are doing the best within the UK have, for instance, gotten rid of their salespeople, and they have more advisors. So when you walk into the dealership, there's someone actually to give you advice on the car, to answer a bunch of questions without being driven monetarily to sell you the car. And that really makes the whole transaction for that consumer a more comfortable situation. The person that they're speaking with now is more of a trusted advisor, as opposed to someone that's just trying to sell them a car. So I definitely think that that's an interesting best practice that we've seen. The other thing is that, you have all these technologies at your disposal now. Within Keyloop, we have a very robust and growing partner ecosystem full of applications that can be connected into the DMS to extend the functionality. And the dealerships that are doing quite well are actually using those applications to do more outreach and to draw their customers into the dealership or into the servicing bay. And so they're switching the way of working into actually almost building pipeline. If I could use more of sales terminology of like having constant outreach to your customer base, letting them know that you're still there, that you're there to support them, letting them know about new offers and things that are happening. that is definitely a shift fundamentally in the mentality of people that work with sales people that work within a dealership. And I think that is key, actually. The days of like sitting in the dealership hoping that someone will come in the front door, while that does still happen, that that is a diminishing pipeline of folks that are actually going to do that. I think thirdly, the last thing that I'll mention is actually the connectivity between the sales, the front of the house, and the sort of back of the house servicing teams. You know, when I'm coming in to the dealership to get my car serviced, the sales team should know that I am coming in and I'm going to be there. They should know the mileage of my car when I bought it. And they should be actually, while I'm sitting there waiting, they should be talking to me, getting me to go and test drive the newest thing that they have in the showroom. Because I mean, you have a captive audience right there. You don't even have to work for it. They're already going to be there. So why not connect those two sides of the business up in a succinct way?
Harvey, you make a really good point there, because we've all been in that scenario where we've been to a dealership where we're taking our car in for a service, and you've effectively got dead time, especially if you're waiting for the service to be done. So what a great opportunity to get that customer into a car to test it for a future purchase.
Exactly. You've got time to kill. You might as well be out there spinning around in something brand new and getting enticed into making that purchase.
Yeah. Now, Harvey, we couldn't let you go before talking to you about Men-Able Wellbeing Winners, because Keyloop as a company, I know you've just recently joined the Men-Able Wellbeing Winners initiative, which is aimed at improving the mental well-being of employees at dealerships and indeed suppliers, and was actually launched here on the podcast last month by Stephen Whitten. So you've signed up to the scheme. Can you tell us what prompted Keyloop to join it and what you're hoping to achieve from it as an organization?
Of course. I mean, Stephen's a great guy, and I think it's an amazing initiative, and one that I think that is long overdue. The reason why we decided to work with him is because it aligns very well with our culture and our values. He comes in and does an assessment, and it's in different areas of the business, like the landscape, people, workplace, culture, processes. All of these things not only lend themselves into the mental health and well-being of your your employees, but also help in terms of tenure long, what's the word I'm looking for? Tenure longevity, the attrition rates of hiring people and then them leaving shortly thereafter. We all know it is a very hot job market. It's extremely hard to hire employees. And then once you get them in the door, you've spent all that money training them, and for them to just walk out the other side, walk out the exit is a real shame. So anything that we can do to actually improve not only the employee experience, but also their health and well-being while they are working for a company, I think is a really great initiative for anyone to be involved in.
You make a good point there about it also reflects well on customers, the customers that your staff are dealing with.
Absolutely. I mean, very often Keyloop's, our messaging is really about customer first and experience first and how we architect our solutions. But really in business, you have two customers. You have your consumer, your end customer, who is going to buy your goods and services. But then you have your internal customer or internal stakeholders, which are your employees. And if you're not architecting processes and a workplace environment to enable them to enjoy being at work and have that ease of getting things done without getting overly frustrated or banging their head against a wall, you really need to take a step back and look at the culture and the processes in the workplace to ensure that you have architected it for them. As a business, there's a lot, right? You not only are trying to sell goods to the end consumer, but make sure that your employees are happy too. But it's extremely important.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, it is a culture. I think, we spent some time with Stephen Whitten, and it's not a tender course, tick a box and get your certificate. This is a full, complete cultural change that needs to happen in that sort of mental health and well-being space from right across, leaders all the way through the business. So it's fantastic and great that you're heavily involved with that. I mean, all I can say here is, we can speak to you for hours, Harvey, and on this, and we're talking to a lot more detail on a lot of areas. But all it means is thank you for joining us today. It's been an absolute pleasure getting some of the insight that you have on the marketplace. And, it'd be great if you can come back on at some time in the future probably as the agency model starts to progress and some of the findings and how it's developing and how the mental health well-being is starting to work across the business as well, and talk about other things that you're noticing across the sector. So, remains to say thank you for joining us today. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I'm sure the listeners will have really enjoyed this chat. And I say, door is open for coming on any time in the future. So it's been an absolute pleasure, Harvey.
Harvey, many thanks for joining us. I echo all that Phil says there. So thanks for joining us, and look forward to catching up with you again soon. And hope you've enjoyed the podcast experience.
No, I have indeed. It's been a real pleasure to speak with you both, and I look forward to doing it again.
Well, I don't know about you, Curtis. Great chat there with Harvey, and sharing some great insight around what her experience has been from other marketplaces, some of the best practice around, the way DMS is integrated with the customer experience. And just referring back to your previous story from Motor Trader about freedom to browse.
Yes.
I think the key message from Harvey was it's all about the customer experience. Customers don't really care whether you're operating under agency or franchise or a blend of both. They just want that nice, seamless experience throughout their buying purchase.
Yeah, and I thought it was fascinating actually, because Harvey actually shed a bit of light on what's going on behind the scenes and the sort of level of integration now needed between OEM systems, dealer systems, so that they're talking to each other and speaking the same language.
Exactly.
Because it is, as you say, all about those customer outcomes and giving customers a good experience in the showroom.
Definitely. So, we've tried covering as many headlines as we can there, and I think with the interviews there with both Steve Young, the snippet there covering what's been happening in Genesis, and obviously with Renault's announcement, and talking with Harvey there, talking about this transition to agency and some of the experience what's in other marketplaces. I hope that's helped add value to some of the headlines that we've discussed this week as well. So, yeah, thanks for staying right till the end there. It's been a long one. But as always, please do check out your podcast feed for the full interview there with Steve Young. I'm sure you will find that fascinating and insightful as always.
But you know what, Phil? That's all we've got time for now. So many thanks for joining us on the Motor Trade Radio podcast. Until next week, it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from him.
You've been listening to Motor Trade Radio Podcast, powered by eBay Motors Group. We'll be sharing all the links from this week's headlines on Monday morning. So to make sure you receive them, just subscribe to the free newsletter on our LinkedIn page. Just search Motor Trade Radio Podcast.